your time. This is our May 2023 College Autism Network Virtual Association of Scholars meeting, and our guest presenters have presented the prompt to everybody in the chat or verbally. What is your walk-up song? So we're seeing Pretty Girl Rock as one option, Born to Run, Run the World, Footloose, Dreams.
I don't want the recording to miss out on Jodi's being Chumbawamba. Make sure that's documented.
For all time on YouTube. Can we make a playlist? This is just a prompt to get everybody engaging in the chat.
They're so good.
Quite a mix here. I don't know if I even have a walk-up song. I guess I have to give that more thought, but I like the selections from everybody. For anybody who's just joined us, we have our Canvas meeting agenda in the chat. So please feel free to list your name and affiliation, highlight it. We also want to remind folks that if you are not already on our Canvas listserv, we know that there might be some new faces joining us today. To please go ahead and sign up. There's a hyperlink in the meeting agenda to join our listserv, where you'll be apprised of our future meetings and different news items that are shared by folks as part of our community, including journal articles, recruitment for studies. We'll also share recordings from our meeting, a recording from our meeting today, in case you'd like to watch it again. And we know some of you watching right now are watching that recording. We also appreciate if you are interested in signing up officially, so to speak, for a CAN membership, because that helps support a variety of the different efforts that we host as part of the College Autism Network. And at this juncture, I'm going to bring in our esteemed leader, Executive Director Lee Williams, to talk about the College Autism Summit.
Hey everyone, great to see you all. I think probably most of you know about this, but in the off chance that you don't have this on your radar, College Autism Summit will happen in October. It's in Nashville at Vanderbilt University. It's a great opportunity for researchers and practitioners to be in conversation with one another. Our call for programs is open right now. The deadline is June 5th. So you can check our website for more information about the summit, but good time guaranteed. And we will play all your walk-up songs if you'd like, if that will get you there. The other thing that I just want to drop in the chat too is we have a new program coming up in June. If you know of a school or institution that is considering starting or getting started on planning an autism or neurodiversity specific support program, at the summit we do an in-person pre-conference workshop. It's a 3-hour workshop on kind of the building blocks of starting that program. But we also know that not everybody gets to go to conferences these days. And so we're doing this online, virtually, as a 3-part webinar series in June. And it's called Square One. And it will be led by Jane Therfield Brown and Lori Ackles. So a great opportunity if your school is thinking about starting a program or you're in the early stages. That's all I've got, Brett. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great title as well, Square One. Thank you, Lee. Now we're going to turn it over to all of you for a few minutes, as you'd like. This is a space in our meetings where we welcome folks to share resources that they'd like the community to know about. If you've read an interesting article, discovered a resource, what would you like to share with the larger Canvas community? Feel free to drop in an item in the chat or turn your microphone on. We'd love to hear what you'd like to share with everybody. We also want to recognize this as a great space to share celebrations too, or accomplishments.
All right, we'll celebrate Morgan, who's our main speaker today, because she successfully defended her dissertation and is graduating in a week. 2 weeks. When is it, Morgan? Soon.
It's the 16th, 18th. It's close. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, perhaps not not necessarily directly related to everybody right here, but the International Society for Autism Research Conference is happening right now in Sweden. So I imagine we'll be getting some interesting insights coming out of there. Oh, in the chat we have Beth mentioning that their youngest child is graduating college next week, and then him and the older sister moving into an apartment together. Oh, that sounds like the setup for a situational comedy, Beth. So maybe the writers that are going on strike, maybe that could be a setup for a comedy in the fall. That sounds great. Thanks for
I'd like to
sharing.
point out that we are celebrating 14 graduates from the Mosaic program today at noon. So we're super excited for them.
Well, congrats.
Awesome. Congrats, Michelle. Other good things or interesting things going on with folks. I think it's hard to top graduations. Those are pretty significant, importantly so.
I did see, I got an email from Sage Publishing that there's a new journal called Neurodiversity. That's exciting. Yeah, I can forward it. I can drop the link in the chat. I just got the email a couple days ago, but I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, please do, Morgan. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Jess Monahan, who's part of our community, is engaged in that space as well.
Okay.
So yeah, I imagine we'll be hearing more about that journal over the coming months too. Well, if there's any other items that folks would like to throw out in the chat, you're welcome to do so. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to our presenters today who come from George Mason University. We have doctors, Morgan Strimel, Grace Francis, and Jodi Duke. We're just glad to have all of them on board today. They're going to be talking about this notion of looking at the whole student, identities in the higher education accommodation process. Certainly, we know that their work is engaged in the space and looking at disability in higher education and those intersections, and we're really glad to have all of them on board. So I'm going to turn it over to the team. Throughout, we encourage you to throw in your comments and questions in the chat because we'll be allocating time toward the end for addressing those. So over to all of you.
Perfect, thank you. And so before I share screen, we can just go ahead and introduce ourselves so we can see all of you still. So hi, I'm Morgan Strimel. I'm at George Mason. Right now I'm working as a research assistant for disability services. But I will note that before this position and before getting my PhD, I did work as an access consultant. So I was in the position of determining accommodations for disabled college students. And I have a couple years under my belt working in the Massey program, which I imagine some of you may have heard of, the Mason Autism Support Initiative at Mason. So happy to be here. I'll turn it over to the Jodi Frankie block and let you guys introduce yourselves.
Hey, my name is Grace Francis. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a faculty member here at George Mason. So I do not identify as neurodivergent, but I have, I do have siblings with disability. I myself have epilepsy. And so kind of that professional, also personal tie to and dedication to the disability community is what has grounded me here.
I'm Jodi Duke, she, her, hers. I am faculty here at George Mason as well. Have learned so much from this research from Morgan and delving into disability services. I'm from a K-12 background, so this has been a great line of research to work on with her. I also, on a personal note, have 2 kids. One is about to go to college and one is in college. Both are neurodiverse, and I'm working really hard with one to get accommodations in place for the fall. And thank goodness I know Morgan, because this is a process. Even when you think you know what you're doing, it is a process. So very helpful to have had this background, but it makes me realize what a struggle and a barrier some of the paperwork and the processes are for families and for students.
Absolutely. And because of Morgan, we know that it can work.
Okay, drawing the line here. No, but thank you guys. And I will add to that something that's been really pertinent to my role in this research has been my own experience pursuing diagnoses post working in the professional role and trying to even just navigate, the medical system and getting this evaluation, that evaluation, what does insurance cover? How do I even find somebody? So it's been a really good learning experience for me and really guided how we went about this research, and kind of what I brought to the table in these conversations was kind of flipping the script and being the student pursuing documentation and accommodations from being the one who is, working through the accommodations process. So I will go to our presentation and we will get rolling. Okay. Thumbs up, anybody? We see it?
Good.
Great. All right, so as Brett said, our presentation is called Looking at the Whole Student, Identities in the Higher Education's Process. I will say this comes from a paper that we wrote and published from our research in the Journal of College Student Development. So I can also share a link to that in the chat too, if you want to see the paper that what our conversation is based off of. So our agenda today is fairly straightforward. So we're going to start by giving a background introduction to our research and really what brought us to forming our research questions and creating the study based on the literature and what we all knew from our own professional experiences. We will then give an overview of the method we used and the approach to answering our research questions. Of course, we'll give an overview of the findings, the main themes from our interviews with disability resource professionals, and then conclude with a discussion of implications based on our research. And so I am going to pass it to Jodi to give a background overview of why did we pursue this study and really what's at the root of this research.
Thanks, Morgan. So the work that we did is really looking at disability resource professionals and the process that they go through to determine reasonable accommodations. That's the phrase in all the law. So the accommodations that are put into place in higher ed should be reasonable. But what does that mean? The guidance on determining these accommodations varies. And so if you look from one institution to another, the requirements are significantly different. Some require extensive documentation, medical diagnosis. That is a tremendous financial and access barrier for so many students. Others are moving towards some of the AHEAD guidelines, which will accept other forms of documentation. I'll give a shout out to Penn State, where my daughter's going, and we don't have to submit evals. We have to submit verification forms, and you do need a doctor to give input, but it doesn't require me paying thousands of dollars for a full eval, which is great. So looking at those processes, and those processes are very deficit focused, focusing on disability labels, deficit-based, not a lot of focus on the whole student, and certainly not an asset-focused approach at all. And so really, this research is grounded in the need for recognition and incorporation of broader student identities, all of the intersectionalities that we know as researchers are so critical to that whole student identity. When they come to campus, they bring all of those identities with them, and that shapes their experience. It shapes how they're able to access instruction, interact with others. And so there's a real need within disability services to be looking at not just those reasonable accommodations, but those identities as well.
Wait, she has to do it.
So the purpose of our research was to explore disability resource professionals' perspectives on the role of these student identities in the accommodations process, and look at how those identities were incorporated into their decision-making for accommodations. Now I'm going to toss it to Frankie for methods.
So we used an interpretive qualitative design to engage in this research. So with an emphasis on surveys and interviews. So the surveys were geared toward perceptions of identities, basic demographic questions, but I'm really going to focus on the interviews for this study because that's the data we're really going to present. So we used I guess to start recruiting, Morgan really maximized her connections in the community through Ahead, but also Can. She also put it on her Twitter, her professional Twitter, to go through those personal connections to make sure that we were able to recruit people who had personal and professional experiences, but also were willing to talk with us. So 13 participants ended up making appointments for interviews. Primarily were white women. We saw a huge geographic representation, which was really fun. We also saw private versus public schools, which was also very interesting, right? Because we know that there are the size difference, sometimes the focus is different at these schools. So when we're thinking about identities and these different perceptions, that was a really, we felt really fortunate to have those participants.
Please pardon my typo of Universitas.
I
I
almost
just noticed it.
I
too.
almost
Sorry,
ripped on
Morgan.
you a little bit, but
You could have, fair game.
fair game. So we used a semi-structured protocol so that we are able to be flexible in our questioning. And that was really critical given the personal nature of their perceptions and their actions and allowing them to really explore what that is. We found that a lot of our participants hadn't considered, while they maybe valued it, whether they agreed with, engaging in positionality or in identities or otherwise, they hadn't really sat down and thought. So that was really beneficial. The protocol, however, did follow, those key components related to the research purpose. So what we wanted to know about their accommodations processes, but specifically their decision-making. So what inputs did they gather? And then most importantly, what did they do with that information, with those inputs? We asked about their perceptions of identities in the accommodations process, including their identities, if those came into play. And if they did, what did they do with those identities? Did they utilize those, or did they really, try to hold those as constant and separate from their decision making? And then also we asked about students' identities related to how the professionals, how our participants went through the decision-making process. So again, did they recognize, identities? What did they do with that? How did they reconcile? Just really leaving it open for them to explore that. So Morgan, can you tell us about what we found?
I will. Yeah, and so I'm going to give an overview of 3 main themes that came out of our thematic analysis of the interviews. And Frankie and Jodi, feel free to jump in and add anything that I miss. But the first theme was that participants truly unanimously agreed that it is important to take a holistic perspective in working with disabled students in any capacity, but particularly in terms of determining accommodations and supporting the implementation of those accommodations. And because a lot of folks talked about how in any, whether you're making accommodation decisions or not, in any capacity that you're working with students, we can't separate disability from any other intersectional identity that they have. And more specifically, that we need to be mindful towards marginalized identities in particular, such as first generation, English language learner, person of color. Because disability is a marginalized identity, we need to be mindful of how other intersectional identities can multiply marginalize our students that we're working with, and not take this narrow approach to disability only, because that can impact the accommodations process in any step. So even getting into the door of a DS office, disability services office, to determining accommodations, to then implementing them. So one example that a participant gave in our interviews for why we need to take this holistic perspective, they talked about how, if a student's a person of color, how does that impact their comfortability, willingness, and professors' reception to facilitating access and asking for access to their accommodations. I remember this person said if I'm a person of color, I may just think, I already stand out enough. Why am I going to put myself back out there again to try and implement my accommodations, especially if there's some hostility there? And so overall, when folks talked about the importance of taking this holistic perspective to working with students, they agreed that this is just an equitable and respectful way to work, adult to facilitate access. And the second theme was, we talked a lot with participants about this holistic perspective and bringing in other identities, but we did talk quite a bit with folks about disability as an identity too, because, that's the field that we're in, and that's the identity that's likely going to be most prominent in our interactions with students. And so when participants talked about our role in needing to understand disability as an identity, it was around recognizing it as one that is complex and unique to all students, right? And so I can say from my own experience is that in working with students, you have some come in who are disabled, proudly leading this group, speaking at this conference about being autistic, for example. Then you have other students who it's very transactional. You kind of follow their lead. They don't really want to be there, and you can tell it's not really a part of their identity. This is just kind of a part of making sure they have access to their experiences. And so it can be very different for students. And so folks talked about in our interviews how we just need to respect disability identity development in particular within our roles, but what we can do as disability resource professionals, or just as folks who work with disabled students, is move away from that medicalized approach and just sort of carry ourselves through that social model approach and empowering students as we can to celebrate disability as an identity, as a part of diversity, and just kind of carry that in our offices and in our interactions to, over time, undo some of that damage of disability stigma that may be hindering folks' ability to really identify with this if that's something that they want to do. And then the last theme was around participants talking about how we can incorporate intersectional identities, disability and beyond, into the accommodations process and facilitating access. And this was in 4 main areas, I would say. And so the first being at the beginning of that accommodations process and considering access to documentation in relation to identities, right? So as Jodi explained, documentation is a really tricky part of our field, and some AHEAD is kind of leading the way and moving away from documentation and really trusting students in their own experiences and their self-report. But it's not the case, right? AHEAD can't mandate that practice amongst disability resource centers or even just individual people, right? And so what still happens is that some students can't even get into the door to talk about accommodations because they don't have a certain diagnosis or certain evaluation to support what they know to be true about themselves. And that can be in relation to different identities, such as being a DACA beneficiary, limited access to monetary resources, to engage in certain evaluations, to get diagnoses. I used to work with students who, in their culture, disability was something that was considered to be shameful, they would share with me, and that for that reason, they were fearful in accessing documentation. And so there can be a lot of different reasons that students don't have that. And so what folks talked about in interviews is, if we're going to take this holistic approach and look beyond just disability, we need to be flexible in how we're getting students in the door, and then in how we're making our accommodation decisions. And so that's the second point here, is in making decisions that are best for the whole student, and not just as a student with a disability. And so an example that came up in our interviews was, for some students, we approve access to certain technologies in the classroom, but do all students have access to certain technologies? Probably not. And so to be more holistic in our understanding of what students' experiences and identities are, looking at them holistically to understand, is this accommodation going to work best for you just as a person, and not just because you're autistic or because you're blind or have low vision? The third was connecting students to other identity-based offices as appropriate. So not just being a transactional disability-based conversation and interaction with students, but if we're learning other components of students' positionalities and different identities, like being a parent, connecting them to a parent group, or if you are very proudly neurodivergent or autistic, let's connect you to this group or to this affinity group. And so just as we're learning more about students, really supporting them in that way and, fostering their identities in different areas as we can. And then finally, being sure to not make assumptions about students' identities. And so again, really letting the student take the lead in sharing these pieces of themselves and not making assumptions based on appearance or things we're reading in a medical evaluation, and just creating natural opportunities for students to share more about themselves so we can learn more about them and then support them more holistically. Jodi, Frankie, anything to add on findings before I keep going?
Sorry, I couldn't figure it out. Darrow, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but like made such a good point in the chat. Like exactly that, not making assumptions, just asking an open-end sheet. They asked, tell me about yourself and how your disability impacts you on a day-to-day basis. Starting with that open question. And Caroline, what are some examples of questions? And we can talk about that in the implications too. Thank you, Caroline, for asking specifically. Do you have anything to add to the findings?
No, I'll wait for implications.
Okay.
Also.
Great, yeah.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, Frankie. Thanks for watching the chat. So yeah, let's talk about implications. So what, right? So we have these ideas from participants about, taking this holistic approach, but how do we do that in practice? And so again, the first implication being to do it, to be intentional and to make that shift in taking the holistic approach, which I do know, I understand that that's more of a radical approach for the field, and that a lot of guidance does focus on, we are disability resource professionals, disability only. We even had a couple of folks in interviews have a kind of a visceral reaction to, I'm just because you have a foster dog doesn't mean that's, something I consider in your accommodations. And it's weird to think about, right? But folks did, ultimately through our conversations agree, yeah, our students are more than just students with disabilities. How can we best support them as students, right? And so a part of that was for folks specifically in disability resource centers, take a step back and evaluate some of the policies and procedures and trainings around accommodation decision-making. And how are we training our disability resource professionals to go about the accommodations process, and how are they doing it? Right? Because once that door closes for an intake or an initial meeting, no one knows what's going on in there aside from the student and the disability resource professional. So really taking time as an office or department or as an individual, if that's within your reach, to evaluate how am I getting from A to B? When I have documentation in front of me and a self-report, what's going on internally that where I'm coming to my accommodation conclusions, and what are my office policies and procedures? Are there ways that we can incorporate some, like what was mentioned in the chat, how can we build in opportunities for students to share more about themselves so we can learn more to better support them? Or are there components of our policies and procedures that are inadvertently creating barriers? Again, for perhaps multiply marginalized students around documentation, for example. And again, engaging students in discussions about their identities and experiences, whether that's in your office policies or not, just, organic ways, which we can talk about in just a second, about, learning more about students, and also thinking critically about the threshold of reasonableness. As Jodi introduced that idea in the beginning, because that's really the anchor of how we're supposed to make accommodation decisions in our field. Is this reasonable or not? And so what we actually did in our interviews was we asked all 13 people, what is reasonable? Like, define that for us. And we got different answers from all 13 people, because it's just vague enough in the law that there's a lot of room for interpretation, and we can kind of create our own thresholds in practice of what is and isn't reasonable. So a big implication from this research and from our interviews is to think about, how are we defining reasonable? And where is that coming from? Is it coming from professional experiences, personal experiences, what we read on the AHEAD listserv, or what we saw in this research article? And just figuring out, how do we define this as individuals in practice and as offices, and how that relates to supporting students more holistically rather than just disability only. And then finally, developing reflexivity-informed practices so we can manage our own biases around our own identities and experiences and those of our students. So Frankie and Jodi, please jump in. What else we got?
I want to address Caroline's question as I talk a little bit about implications for autistic students specifically. I think when you're doing that intake process, it's such a great question, Caroline, about what can you ask examples. So many of you may have experienced the same thing we have, which is that some autistic students are very comfortable disclosing not only their identities, but their disability and their diagnosis, but others are not. And we've even been seeing lately that some of the students that we're working with are, they're aware they're autistic, but they're not necessarily aware of the challenges that they might be facing in different areas. We've been seeing that pretty extensively in high school students, where when we sit down to work on goals or things like that, they really have trouble generating areas to work on because they haven't really had a lot of experience delving into their own diagnoses, I would say. And so that's a really sensitive thing, but I would suggest that you think about questions like, what are some of the things that helped you in high school? I think is a great one. What did help and what didn't help, because the didn't help is just as important. I would love for folks to ask, in a normal day, what type of support would be helpful to you as you're just going through your day? Because I think so much of it is academic, but there are also pieces that, especially if you have a support program, an autism support program, you can engage some other supports across the person's day. I want to make sure, because I want to make sure I'm getting all the parts of that question. Will you scroll back up real quick? Sorry. It was a lot. There we go.
Sorry.
And then in terms of other factors, so specifically with autistic students, things like the social interactions, communication, even sensory. So another big part for disability services is thinking about, safe spaces in terms of break areas and quiet spaces. And so those are all things that, honestly, if you look at a lot of evaluations, it doesn't include some of that. So I think those personal conversations with the students are key. We are also seeing across our research a pretty significant discrepancy between what parents tell us about their young adult and what the autistic young adult themselves says. And so again, just having that conversation with the student themselves, who may not have a lot of experience coming into college advocating for themselves, but it's really important that you start to ask the questions. One of the things that we've done with Morgan in some of this research is to create, to just literally have a printout of the social identity wheel where you just ask people to list their different positionalities. And I think that would be a really meaningful exercise with students coming in as well. Tell me about you. Like, I'm a dog mom, all the things. And then that gives you a really nice sort of entry point to build a relationship, to start having these conversations. Okay, Frankie's working on a question.
So Morgan, one of the questions, I'm like taking notes from the chat. One of the questions Beth had was about any information about staff and funding allocations based on student needs, influx of students, if we gathered any information about that, or I would imagine if you can speak to that on a professional level.
So staffing, I can pull up the question too. So if staffing structures came up in our interview.
It was Beth, sorry.
Staffing and funding and how I'll operate.
Do you guys want me to explain what I
was just about to say,
asking?
yeah, that's great.
Okay, so I know from some informal conversations that I've had with people at institutions, mainly smaller institutions that I'm connected with, that because students are coming to disability services to request accommodations after they've already been accepted to the university and are in the sort of onboarding process of becoming students at the school, that sometimes the disability services office is sort of overwhelmed by a big influx of students who are requesting services. And I'm wondering to what extent, if any of the participants talked about their the processes they use as a way of sort of gatekeeping without really wanting to gatekeep, but understanding that they're stretched very thin.
Got it. So around like student staff ratios in, got it.
Yes.
So somewhat, Jodi and Frank can fill in gaps if I miss anything, but I know we interviewed some folks who were like offices of one, which isn't terribly uncommon. I feel like it's more common than we realize, of just one disability resource professional. And in those instances, I can remember some folks talking about trying different models of like, let me try to do an email intake meeting and see how that works. Or maybe students can just use this software to request an accommodation and that works. But I feel like what folks came to and trying to do those, like, let me streamline maybe some of the more straightforward requests of, like extended time on a test when there's an IEP that showed that this was something they used for the last 8 years. Let me just try to send them this way so then I can focus more of my time on more complicated requests. That was a whole other aspect of this research, was straightforward versus a complicated request. But folks ultimately came to decisions that in any case, talking to students and having the interactive process that we rely on in the field was so important to be able to more effectively understand access related needs and barriers that were coming up. But yes, it's also common for disability services offices to be understaffed and to experience that feeling of being overwhelmed. I know at Mason, this data is very fresh in my head. So let me see what I got here. So AHEAD just came out with updated information like 2 days ago on the state of disability services offices. So if you're a member of AHEAD, that's available now. And offices on average of an institution size such as Mason have a staff to student ratio of 1 to 150. And that's like a 30,000 students or more university. And at Mason, we have a staff to student ratio of 1 to 650. And so that leads students to wait approximately 3 to 4 weeks right now for an intake meeting. And so I'm not sure if I'm still answering your question, but point being, you can imagine that because that's kind of the state of the field right now for a lot of different offices, for various reasons, that we can kind of inadvertently create barriers to access by just not being available. So yeah, that did come up some in the interviews, and I can speak for Mason that that's happening here.
Yeah, Morgan, I didn't know that was our statistic. It's really bad.
Bad. Yeah.
Really bad. So this connects to the question about mental health support, and the work that we've done here really supports what Morgan's talking about with our autistic college students waiting to get help. If you walk in and you are, if you are not in immediate crisis, in our interview research, we've been told they give you an iPad with some kind of online app option to sort of work through some kind of counseling process, but to get actual FaceTime with someone in counseling is really, really challenging. And then in most institutions, this is how it is here at Mason. And we're not bad mouthing Mason. This is exactly like Adero says, this is across universities, but there's a limit to how many visits you can have with mental health professionals on campus. So CAPS here has a cap of 7 visits, and then they refer out. And that refer out model is necessary because of the numbers we're talking about, but extremely dangerous, because when you think about all the identities we're talking about, and you think about all the different marginalized communities, and here at Mason, we pride ourselves on having a lot of diversity. Not all our students can access those services. And so that is a really big issue. Eleanor, definitely. I think what we do about it, Eleanor, if you'd like to come to another presentation, we'll do another day, is that our team has developed a mental wellness curriculum that we're teaching to high school students and their families to equip them with some of these coping strategies and communication skills before they come to college, so that hopefully we can sort of hit them with support and skills before this need is happening, because we're finding it's too late when they're in college. They need such immediate support. But the mental health piece goes right along with it.
Something that's really interesting too is with the mental health, I just sat in, and Morgan, after I say this, I'll hand it off to you because I think that there was questions about disability service office and DEI collaborations and collaboration with student services and supporting faculty, which is what you all are doing right now. And it's really amazing. But I learned in this group that there's collaboration with the counseling department and the psychology department. And so they're really trying to it's innovative, which is kind of sad because it should just be like integrated and it's very like kind of like a no duh thing. But as a faculty member who's hugely invested in this, in interfaces with students all the time who are in crisis, with and without disclosed disabilities, I was unaware of these services. So I think it's the crisis mitigation with a lack on prevention, but also sometimes people are doing stuff that we don't know. Therefore, our students don't know, and it just kind of perpetuates this cycle. But I'm wondering, Morgan, I'm trying to keep track of the questions. If you want to talk about the work you're doing now, that your dissertation jump-started in terms of bringing together these stakeholders. I know we serve on different groups.
Yeah, for sure. So the question was, are there examples of DS offices partnering with DEI to promote disability culture? And so I will say one thing first, and this is not a sweeping generalization, but I find that sometimes in looking for examples and talking to folks that partnering with DEI offices alone, partnering with DEI offices is great, but alone, a lot of times DEI, at times can not include disability. And I don't think that's surprising to maybe to everyone here that that disability is not generally included. And so sometimes the work we're doing right now is making sure disability is even defined as a component of DEI at the institution. And so that's a big part of the work we're doing right now. But what we are doing at Mason is because we are trying to completely move in this direction and revamp, shift disability culture on campus. And so in figuring out where to even start, because like we talked about with the staff to student disparities, just maintaining compliance is really challenging. And so creating the time to do this kind of work is really challenging when we already sometimes are falling behind in just facilitating access to then, move into this inclusion aspect and social justice aspect of this work. And so I think as far as examples go, the universities who are kind of leading the charge here are those that are getting disability cultural centers off the ground. That's a huge part of really very overtly making disability an aspect of diversity, but that also comes down to funding, resources, space, staffing. So an example I always like to give is University of Arizona, where Amanda Krause is working, is just the goal of institutional culture around disability. But what we're trying to do at Mason is, yes, partnering with DEI, but a lot of their work is focused on anti-racism right now, which is great. But we are partnering with other identity-based offices too. Sometimes it's just, having a conversation to make sure that we can connect students back and forth and create that relationship. But also what I spend most of my own time personally doing is talking to other offices and getting in front of groups of people in different identity-based offices or just student affairs offices to talk about, access alone is great. And, accommodations are great, but that's not all we need to do. That access does not guarantee inclusion, and just trying to get into pockets of people to start changing mindsets and hopefully trickle over time as we're trying to accumulate some of the resources and time to go bigger and to get a cultural center off the ground and to maybe hire someone full-time who's working on disability culture work full-time. So to answer your question, Arizona is a great place to look, but I think any institution you can probably find pockets of people who are trying to do things behind the scenes that may not be very obvious yet, but hopefully have that domino effect over time.
This is all such great context. This is Brett chiming in. You all are just so efficient and thoughtful in your responses. There have been so many questions in the chat, and I want to make sure in the remaining 10 minutes we have that you all can address them further. Looks like we have one from Alex, who asks, as far as you all spoke about providing identity-related supports, but does this also include mental health supports? Thinking about mental health can impact needs of disabled and neurodivergent students. Second question from Alex, are there examples of disability services? Oh, well, I guess you all kind of addressed that. I'm overwhelmed with all the questions, but if at least you can perhaps address maybe the first one.
And Alex, did Jodi address it in her first component, or do you want us to elaborate more?
You're good. We can go to the next question.
Okay,
I'm-
there's a lot of really good questions here.
I'm wondering, there was one about professional development for DSO staff, and I think all, I would say, faculty and staff with regard to intersectionality and student identities, and specifically autistic students, because it's crushing. It's when identities are not honored and not recognized, right? Especially multiply marginalized identities. So maybe we could talk about, or just brainstorm as a group, what we learned in our research, but also, you know, in our work about professional development opportunities and ideas to address intersectionality among our autistic students. And that also includes autistic students who experience mental health, who have co-occurring needs, or autistic students with other identities.
I can start, and then I love the idea of brainstorming as a great idea. And so what's come out of this research, some professional development that I've done at AHEAD and at Mason and with AHEAD Virginia, is just getting, and with disability resource folks specifically, is to really dig into what reflexivity and positionality mean, and to start bringing some of those principles of the qualitative research in, to be very introspective, and to kind of shift the mindset away from, you know, trying to be this objective professional who just determines reasonable or not reasonable, reasonable or not reasonable, but to really dig into what we are bringing to the table based on our own disability experiences, what we learn from the media, family disability experiences, just, you know, working with students for years and years and years, what we think, you know, an autistic student, what accommodations are good or reasonable or not. And so that's kind of where I've started based on this research, is to just talk about reflexivity as a framework to bring into the accommodations process, so that we can start, this is not just like a one-way, you input output, you tell me things and then I tell you if it's reasonable or not, but to make it more of this reflexive dialogue where we're being very in tune with what our gut reactions are around what is or isn't reasonable. That's been powerful thus far. Did Jodi, Frankie, or other folks have ideas for what kind of training would be applicable?
This one is so big because I think that you've got these layers. You've got the folks in disability services who are probably the most receptive to this idea. When you move out a little bit to faculty and how do we get faculty on board, that's a whole different conversation. As faculty members, we see it every day in the work that we do. So again, that positionality that we talked about, there was a positionality wheel. We put a link to the social identity wheel, which is very similar. But Morgan, I think, will be sending out the positionality wheel. I think it begins with that self-examination of any stakeholder, whether that's disability services or faculty, to identify our own identities. And then, like Morgan said, digging into your biases. There are so many biases that we have. I see them every day here on campus. As you know, yesterday we're in a meeting and one of our autistic students pops in because he saw a Panera bag and he wanted some bread. And like, to me, that's no big deal. But then the comments people make, you're like, yeah, okay, you've got some significant bias going, like you know, because you know he's autistic. So that shows the danger of disclosure in some of these situations, right? And so I think that as a community, those are the conversations we have to have about how do we make sure that we're respecting all of these identities that these students are brave enough to disclose, and then how are we advocating and teaching them to advocate for themselves? I don't know, I kind of got off the question a little onto like a soapbox there. Sorry.
I think the thing is, oh wait, you took a breath because you.
I was just going to say, Beth.
Oh yeah.
Felson, shout out to one of our grads, Beth Felson, with a great idea. Yes, the yes,
Autism
Would be
Self-Advocacy
amazing.
Network,
it's a great idea. So that's a big piece of this, is bring autistic voices to the table to have these discussions with the stakeholders as well, so that the decisions are being made together, not for somebody.
Totally. So something we struggle with is compensation, because so often we call upon, like, not like neurotypical folks call on neurodivergent folks to like inform and teach, and it's really disempowering. like putting that burden on someone, but also not reaping the benefits, right? Or them not being compensated for their time and expertise. So I think that's something that really should be we pay other, experts lots of money for them to come in, and self-advocates or just autistic folks in general should be invited and honored and compensated and they should hold us accountable to doing something. So I think oftentimes with PD, there's no accountability piece. And then with that comes I can kind of think the crescendo, the next point, and this is a lot of the work Morgan is doing in direct collaboration with the DSO here, who are amazing, by the way. We are so lucky. We have a poppin' team here, is getting those passionate insiders, right? Like getting faculty who have disabilities or faculty who give all kinds of cares about people with disabilities, getting staff in there, getting students, all of these stakeholders, and coming together and creating a charge for the president, creating a charge to people in power and holding them accountable. Morgan's smiling. And I think it's, so yes, getting to PD, but I think making it accountability, right? Otherwise it's just lip service and it's so disempowering. I don't know, Morgan, if you want to hit that last piece, because I truly do think that that is the change agent to make PD mandatory for everyone, not just a DSO, and also that accountability piece.
Yes, I'm also typing our emails in the chat in case people need to jump off. But yeah, so that's really been the work we've been doing over the last couple months, is we have to bring an authentic charge to our president. So we did multiple focus groups with folks with disabilities and disability advocates, and then took all the data from the focus groups on how is Mason doing, how can we do better? And we've brought it into working groups to develop authentic action items from our community to bring to leadership at the institution, because we do, and I really grapple with that of why does this need to be mandatory? Why don't people just want to do better and learn and come to these trainings and learn how to support students more holistically? But that's just, I've come to that conclusion. That's what it comes down to. And I think that it's going to have to come top down, bottom up, left, right, left, diagonal to really initiate some change in our institutions. Okay, I'm putting our email in the chat because I know people need to go.
This has been excellent. Grace, Jodi, Morgan, do you have any final thoughts or reflections that you want folks to leave here with today?
Thanks for being here and this is the most engaged chat I've ever had. So please forgive me if we missed anything, but for me at least, and I think Jodi and Frankie too, email at any time. Happy to talk more about what we're doing at Mason, the research, anything like that. We're very much an open book.
Yeah, thanks for having us. And we're so proud of Morgan for leading this work, and not just the research, but the practice piece too here at Mason, the charge that she's leading, where we're in working groups and we have the same playing field. We're right in there with students and others. And so she's created a really exciting community here to sort of move this forward.
And we're your ultimate hype people, Morgan, because we've learned so much from you. But Morgan also has a ton of publications on this, and they're truly meant to be digested and they're actionable. And so I would also recommend, I use them in my own work too, and generalize them to other places and spaces, right? What happens pre-graduation, what happens post-graduation. We're a blip. Right. And so oftentimes universities are the center of our towns and communities, we feed, we take. So how can we maximize and capitalize on our institutions? How can we, instead of being indoctrinated, how can we institutionalize disability as diversity, right? It can be done. I think we're in a really great position of influence.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I think you all really honor the intent of what we do with Canvas, is where we bring folks across a variety of different spaces and disciplines to come together to learn about something we all share in common, but then we're also dispersing these insights to our respective groups. And I think you all, demonstrate that at George Mason too, this desire that folks do not remain in their silos, and that those that information, those resources, those ideas get out to a variety of folks so that, you can institute action. And I think similarly, publishing this in Journal of College Student Development also reaches your higher ed researchers, folks in spaces that I occupy who definitely need to engage in this reflection as well. So thank you all for a wonderful presentation. Like mentioned, this is recorded, so folks can check this out at a later time if they would like. And we're taking our annual little June break, but we'll be back here in July. We're in the process of securing presenters for July and beyond. So stay tuned over the coming weeks via our listserv for that information. But thank you again, Morgan and Grace and Jodi. Excellent. We appreciate all of you, and we appreciate all of you joining in for your wonderful and intentional questions. The three of you were masterful in attending to them in a very quick format. Usually we pull them together at the end and you're like, we're on it. So nicely done. Yeah, we'll look forward to seeing everybody back here in July. In the meantime, stay tuned to the Canvas listserv for updates and to share articles and resources and news and other items that might benefit our community. So we'll see you back here soon. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Can.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Brett.